So again, good morning. So I'll be sharing you the reference that I have shared you in our Facebook group. Okay. So can you see my screen? All right. So let's go to the tax remedies of the government. Now, the tax system here in the Philippines is self-assessment, meaning it is the taxpayer that declares the amount of sales, the amount of expenses, and the amount of net income. So how would the government make sure that the taxpayer is reporting proper income and proper taxes? Well, it has remedies against the taxpayer, meaning it can check and validate the accuracy of these tax returns, and they can run after these taxpayers. Okay, so the system in the Philippines is called self-assessment, meaning it's the taxpayer that computes, declares income, sales, or whatever basis of taxation, okay, and then submits that and pays that to the government. However, as we have mentioned, the government can run after this under declaration of taxes through its remedies. So primarily, there are two remedies by the government. As you can see in my screen, all right, um, first is the assessment, and then later on the collection. All right. Now, assessment simply is actually the computation of the tax deficiency. For example, I declared in my tax return net income amounting to 1 million pesos. And then later on, it was found out that it's not just 1 million. So what would the government do? It will assess or compute the amount of tax, and the difference between the tax that I paid and the tax that should be paid is called the tax deficiency or deficiency in the tax. Now, for the assessment, so that the government can gather information, it could get information through the following. Did you see this? A, B, C, D. So first, it may obtain data and information from third parties. So what do we mean by the third party? Well, primarily, the first and second parties are the government, the BIR, that is the agency of the government that collects taxes, and the taxpayer. So those are the first two parties. And who is the third party? That would be either the customer or supplier of the taxpayer. Okay? For example, I have this client. He's an engineer, and he provides construction services to SM. Now, in one of his contracts, he issued a receipt amounting to 5 million pesos. Okay, now, the taxpayer or the contractor, when he issued the receipt, okay, indicated his TIN number or tax identification number in the receipt, and that receipt will be reported by SM as reference to their expenses. Now, during that time, the contractor declared his sales that is much lower than 5 million, maybe more than a million. So, the system of the BIR would reconcile the expense recorded by this taxpayer, which is SM, and the revenue recorded by this taxpayer, which is the contractor, and they could see a very large discrepancy. So in that case, the system would prompt, okay, a discrepancy so that the BIR would go after the taxpayer. So where did the information come from? It would be the customer of this taxpayer. So that is the third party. Sometimes the BIR would also get the list of customers of one particular taxpayer, and then they will validate whether the amount sold to those particular customers were recorded by those particular customers, so they would reconcile. The other way of obtaining information so that they would make sure or they would validate whether you reported correct sales or not for tax purposes is conducting inventory surveillance. Now, I have this classmate who worked with BIR, that's the Bureau of Internal Revenue, who went to the gate of a warehouse of a food distributor. So he just waited there for the whole day and counted the number of trucks coming out of the warehouse. So for example, there are 10 truckloads of goods that came out during the day, and you will estimate the cost of each truckload for maybe 200,000. So 200,000 per truckload times 10, that would be 2 million, right? So at least the sale recorded for each day is 2 million. You multiply that for maybe 20 days of operation per month times 12. And then he would compare that to the sales recorded by the taxpayer. And so he could see the discrepancy. And then they could compute or assess any tax deficiency. Now, another way is to inspect the books of accounts of a taxpayer, especially those taxpayers who have electronic record. So the government, through the BIR, may check on your records and see whether the sales reported in your tax return and your sales reported in your books are the same. So if they would find any discrepancy, again, they will assess or compute tax deficiency. Or maybe they will prescribe presumptive gross sales. So what is a presumptive gross sales? Now, if you are operating in this industry, it is presumed that your gross sales or receipts would be that this much. Now, that is applied to transportation. Remember that, those operating taxis or jeepneys, they are subject to 3% common carriers tax. But the BIR or the government has established a certain amount of presumptive gross sales. Okay, so they pay a fixed amount of 3% tax for those type of business or industry. Okay, so if they would compute your tax deficiency, if you belong to that industry, they already have a presumptive gross sales or receipts. So those are the ways to determine the tax deficiency, okay, on how they assess. Now, the prescriptive period of assessment is 3 years. What does that mean? It means that if you filed a tax return and the government did not audit you for 3 years, then they can no longer audit you on the 4th year. Okay? The period has prescribed, or it's like it has expired. No. However, there is exception. Okay, later on to this prescriptive period. Now, we need to know the deadlines of taxes for filing returns. Why? Because if you fail to file or pay taxes, then the government would come after you. The government would assess you for uh, failed return or for non-payment of taxes. For example, let's go to the income tax return. Take note that for individuals, okay, the operating year is only the calendar year. All right? Individuals cannot choose to operate in a fiscal year. So they are only allowed to operate from January to December. Now, the deadline for filing the income tax return would be April 15 of the following year. For example, I have made here a simple illustration that I presented to the other class. All right. Okay. Where's the tax calendar here? Hang on, no? Mhm. Here. Okay. I believe some of you were not able to finish some other tax subjects, right? Okay, hang on. Now, we are talking here about the individual, all right? So, if the individual is reporting its annual income tax return, the BIR form is uh, actually 1701. So, for the whole year, okay, the individual should submit its annual income tax return on or before April 15 of the next year. So from January, in fact, the taxpayer can submit its annual income tax return, but it should not go beyond April 15. Now, why are we talking about this? Okay, these deadlines. Because if you fail to pay on that date, then you will be paying penalties, okay, and surcharges. Now, let's go to the corporation. All right, the income tax return for corporations is due on the 15th month of the fourth month following the end of the fiscal or calendar years. So for the corporation, if the operating period is a calendar year, then it would be just the same, due on April 15 of the following year. However, corporations are allowed to operate under a fiscal year. For example, UC, no? UC ends its fiscal year by, say, for example, July 31. Okay, so if UC ends its operation by July 31, when would be the due date of its annual income tax return? So let's count, no? The fourth month, that's from August, September, October, and November. So the due date would be November 15. Okay? Now, how about the capital gains tax return? Okay, so as you can see in your handout, there are transactions like selling of domestic stocks or shares that are subject to capital gains tax. We call that transactional return because they do lots of transactions. And then there's also a capital gains tax that are actually one-time transactions like the sale of real property that should be 30 days from the date of sale. Okay, so for transactional returns, those who are selling domestic stocks, all the transactions must be reported and paid within 30 days from the date of sale. However, for this industry, they have an annual return or a summary of all their capital gains tax, and it must be paid and filed on the fourth month, a 15th day of the fourth month following the end of the year. So it's similar with the income tax return deadline filing. Okay? Now, also there are withholding tax returns. Okay? So in your handout, we have your withholding tax of final and fringe benefit tax. It must be paid 10 days following the month. And there's also withholding tax on compensation and expanded withholding tax. Okay. So may I go back to our illustration here, okay? And let us review some of the basic taxes. This is from the point of view of a business, okay? Now, every year, the business pays annual registration fee that is 500 pesos, and the BIR form is 0605. And it must be paid from January 1 to January 31. For all business organizations, whether you are taxable or not, you are required to pay 500 every start of the year. Now, we have some clients, like cooperatives or maybe religious organizations who are not paying this annual registration fee. So what happens? If you get a tax clearance or if the government would find out, then they would assess these tax deficiencies, and they can see from their database these tax deficiencies. We call this as open cases, and so the government would assess. Also, if you are doing business, you would remember from your tax 101 that the business may either be a percentage tax, this is non-VAT, or VAT. Now, if you are paying percentage tax, you use BIR form 2551Q, and you have to pay the percentage tax for each quarter on the 25th following the quarter. Okay? Do you remember this? Okay? So, if you don't, then of course, again, there will be some tax deficiency. However, if the taxpayer is a VAT registered taxpayer, the VAT payable is due every month by using the BIR form 2550M, and the VAT for January should be paid on or before the 20th of the following month. However, for VAT registered taxpayers, there is also a quarterly return for VAT, which is due on the 25th following the quarter. So you see there's a lot of due dates for these taxes. And this is very, very crucial if you are working as a tax practitioner or if you are working as an accounting staff for a company. Why? Because if you miss the deadline, sooner or later, the government would find out, or probably if you need to get a tax clearance, they will check all your tax compliances and they will assess all non-filing or non-payment of tax returns. Okay? That's the reason why, these due dates, okay, are included here because the taxpayer needs to comply. All right? Okay, so you may go over these due dates, okay, in your handout. Now, as I've mentioned, the government has 3 years to audit a taxpayer. Otherwise, if the government did not audit a taxpayer, they can no longer audit the taxpayer beyond 3 years. However, there is an exception to the 3-year prescriptive period. And primarily, there is no prescription for fraudulent returns, meaning there is an intentional effort from the taxpayer to underdeclare the tax return. Okay? So there's fraud. Or there is willful neglect to file, meaning the taxpayer did not file his tax returns. And willful neglect normally is 3 consecutive tax periods. So if you did not file your tax returns for 3 years, that is already a willful neglect to file, and therefore the 3-year prescriptive period does not apply. Or if the taxpayer applied for investigation, therefore the taxpayer waives the 3-year prescriptive period, and that may be extended for 120 days. Okay, so now let's go to the stages of assessment. So how would the BIR know which taxpayer would it audit, okay, compute the tax deficiency, and later on give the assessment? So we have here the stages of assessment. So first, there is selection of the taxpayer to be audited. Okay? So basically, there are 4 ways on how the government selects the taxpayer to be audited. First, there's what we call as tax compliance verification drive. Uh, this is done by BIR employees by going around business areas. In fact, even in our neighborhood, they come sometimes. And they check on the business registration of all businesses. No, maybe they would go to the sari-sari store, and then they would ask, hello, how are you? Can we see your BIR form 2303? That is the certificate of registration. Or they would go to the shopping mall and they would check on all the stalls if they have BIR registration. So what happens if they found out that you are operating without BIR registration, or you did not pay the annual registration fee? Then they will assess. Okay? So they will get your TIN or tax identification number, and then they will compute all your tax deficiencies. They will come back and give you the computation. So you have to pay. All right? So that's tax compliance verification drive. Sometimes you would see stickers, okay, in these establishments. Sometimes it's color green, sometimes it's yellow or red. It's called the tax map, okay? So it means that BIR personnel went to that store already to conduct tax compliance verification drive. Now, another way of, being tagged as a taxpayer subject for audit would be the information given by tax informers. Okay? So, for example, you are operating in one area, and the other businesses who are tax registered business would find out that you are not registered. So what would they do? They would go to the BIR and inform them that somebody is operating without tax registration. So again, the BIR would assess or would audit that particular business owner. Also, there's what we call as pre-audit of tax returns. There was a time before that before we submit the tax returns to the bank for payment, the bank would ask us to go first to the BIR so that the BIR personnel would check on the tax returns. So what would they do? Well, they would check the correction of the mathematical computations, if these expenses were deducted, or it was filled up with the correct columns, etc. Okay, so we call that as pre-audit. Now, during the course of the pre-audit, if they found out that there is a very big difference or discrepancy, for example, of your sales, probably they would ask you, where are you renting? And you would say, well, I'm renting in SM. And they would know that if you rent in SM, probably you are paying between 40 to 60,000. But in your declaration, you have like 20,000 every month sales. So immediately they would know that there is tax deficiency, so they would assess you. All right? Or there's also direct field observation by revenue officers. I've mentioned to you a while back that sometimes they go to the business area. Okay? Like um, you declared that you keep on having losses. But when the BIR personnel went to your place, customers are lining up. And so they would count the number of customers for the day, and they will just multiply that for example, to 100 pesos, no? The estimated amount for each customer. And then they would compare that to the tax return that you have filed. So you will be subject to tax assessment. So again, these are the ways that the BIR, okay, would check whether a taxpayer should be subject to assessment or not. Okay, so after identifying or selecting the taxpayer subject to audit, then they will audit the taxpayer. So take note of these 3 steps, okay? Just like, uh, serving a warrant of arrest, so that the authority or the policeman have the authority to arrest somebody. Same thing with assessing taxes. They cannot assess without this letter of authority to the revenue officer. All right? Now, in fact, the LA or letter of authority is not given to the taxpayer. It is actually given to the revenue officer, and then the revenue officer would show this to the taxpayer, showing that he was granted authority to assess or to check on the books of the taxpayer. Now, LA may come from 3 sources. So, take note that the BIR, okay, has a national office in Manila, and then it has different revenue district offices all around the country. Now, the revenue district office in Baguio is found in front of SM, and that's also the regional office for Cordillera. The revenue district office number of Baguio is 8. So we are under RDO 8. Now, if the letter of authority comes from the RDO or Revenue District Office, it must be signed by the regional director. Now, if your business is under Large Taxpayer Service or LTS, then it must be signed by the Assistant Commissioner of the LTS. By the way, who or which business is under RDO and which business is under LTS in Manila? To be qualified as a large taxpayer, there are qualifications and you will be listed by the BIR so that you are under LTS. One of the qualifications is having an annual sales of 1 billion pesos. Okay? So if your sales or receipts is 1 billion, you will qualify under LTS, and so the local or RDO examiners will not go to your place to audit you. Rather, it would come from LTS or Large Taxpayer Service Audit Division. Now, there are cases also of big companies that are being investigated by the BIR. So this time, they will fall under National Investigation Division and Special Investigation Division. So for example, maybe you have heard about the Mighty Cigarette, okay? They were caught by the government for not paying excise taxes on its cigarettes. So they were shut down by the government. Now, these are handled by National Investigation Division or Special Investigation Division because these are big-time uh, tax fraud cases. Okay? So now, uh, the letter of authority is valid under these two requisites. Okay? Take note. While everybody knows that a person cannot be arrested without a warrant, for taxpayers, a taxpayer cannot be assessed without a letter of authority. Now, for the requisite for the LA to be valid, number one, it must be served within 30 days. And the LA must be coming from the national office, and then the national office will forward it electronically to the revenue district office, and then they will print the electronic LA under BIR form 1966. Okay? Now, I mentioned about this client who was assessed by the BIR, right? I know this because it was my classmate that assessed him, that's trying to look for him. So they have this LA. However, this LA must be submitted within 30 days, or it must be received by the taxpayer himself within 30 days. So what did the taxpayer do? He keeps on hiding for 30 days. So what happens if the LA would expire and has not been served within 30 days to the taxpayer? They will generate again another LA. So what happens again? He hid again, no? And he just put a padlock in his gate, and he's nowhere to be found within 30 days. So what happened to the LA? Nothing. Okay. Sige. So, on the following year, they would generate again another LA for the taxpayer. Eventually, he settled. Okay? So, take note no, of these two requisites. All right? First, it must be served within 30 days, otherwise it would expire. Second, it must be an electronic LA. Now, why did the government do this? Because before, letter of authority can be initiated by the revenue district office. So if somebody would like to harass your business, okay, they would just, come up with a letter of authority, and then now they have the authority to check on you. Okay, but this time, that's not the case. So first, they will feed the information, and then they will request from the national office to generate LA. The LA will be sent to the revenue district office, and then they will print the letter of authority and assign a particular revenue officer. Okay? Now, if you are conducting business, the notice given to you is LA or letter of authority. However, if you are not conducting business, there are other notices that the BIR may provide you. The other one is TVN or tax verification notice. This is given to one-time transactions. They call it as ONET. Okay? And examples of one-time transactions are your estate tax, donor's tax, and capital gains tax. All right? For example, of course, the dissident only dies once, right? So the dissident died, and then you pay the estate tax. And then that's it. Now, later on, DIR discovered that the property transferred or the estate was underdeclared. So what would they issue? So that they will examine the records? It's not LA. They will issue TVN or tax verification notice. Same thing with donations or capital gains tax. Okay? So like me, I only had once, paying capital gains tax. In fact, it should be the seller that should pay this, but when I bought property, okay, it's me that paid for capital gains tax. So probably later on, the government discovered that, the property was underdeclared to save on taxes, and then they will go after you. You would receive TVN or tax verification notice. Okay, now, as I've mentioned, LA comes from the national government forwarded to the Revenue District Office. There's also what we call as letter of notice. Okay, so this is it says communication from the BIR National Office informing the taxpayer of a uh, finding, okay, of significant discrepancy between sales and purchase reported in his tax return and information obtained by the BIR from third parties. Okay? So LA is different from LN. So they would just require you to submit pertinent documents, but just the same, you will be subject to assessment. Now, look at this. There's data matching system, no? So I gave you an example a while back of uh, a taxpayer giving a receipt to its customer, okay? Now, if you don't report the revenue for that particular receipt issued to a customer, okay, the government system, the government database would find out, okay, and then automatically you will be subject to assessment. We call that as data matching system, okay? That's the reason why some taxpayers only report revenue or sales that are based on their receipts that were issued, no? Sometimes maybe you go to some gasoline stations, and then the gas boy would ask you, "Sir, do you want a receipt?" Of course, that should not be asked. The government requires everybody to issue receipts. But why would they ask? Because as much as possible, they don't like issue receipt so that they cannot declare or they can underdeclare their sales for that portion that were not issued with receipts. Okay? Now, if a taxpayer was subjected by an investigation, all right, the revenue officer has 120 days to do this. Okay? Now, what happens if during this 120-day period, the investigation is not complete? Excuse me. Okay. So the ELA may be revalidated. Okay. So again, there are 120 days for the examiner to conduct the audit. Again, a taxpayer should only be subject to audit once in every taxable year. But there is an exception. For example, you were under audit. Now, later on, they discovered that there's another fraud that the taxpayer committed. So, he can be subjected to another audit in the same taxable year. Okay? And there are other reasons also why a taxpayer may be subjected to another audit more than once in one taxable year. Okay? Well, another case is when a taxpayer requests for investigation, or maybe there's another tax compliance that's subject to investigation, like withholding taxes, okay, or capital gains tax, or through the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue. Okay? Now, take note that the ELA may be revalidated, right? Okay? It can be revalidated once if it is issued by the RDO, or twice if issued by the national office. Okay? So going back, what will you do if you know that you will be served with a letter of authority? Letter A, you hide for at least 30 days. Okay? Or letter B, you go to the BIR and settle your tax. What would you do? Okay. So of course, since you are a law-abiding citizen, you go to the BIR and settle your tax, right? Okay? Sige. Now, um, after after the selection of the uh, taxpayer subject to assessment, okay, and they will conduct the audit. Oh, by the way, no? After the examination, then the revenue officer will report the investigation, okay, and recommendation to the taxpayer. So they will give you the list of the taxes that you have to pay. Now, basically, there are four things that you need to pay. Okay? So primarily, there's what we call as tax deficiency. And then aside from the tax deficiency, there are other charges. Okay? Now, let's go first to the tax deficiency. For example, I declared my sales to be 4 million pesos. But later on, when I was subjected to assessment, they found out that I did not declare sales amounting to 1 million pesos. Now, if a taxpayer is subject for assessment, that 1 million pesos is also treated as a taxable income. Okay? So the taxpayer cannot raise the issue that, you know what, that 1 million peso sale has, cost of sale, and there's related expenses to that also. So the net income that is subject to tax for that 1 million, in fact, is like 100,000 pesos. The government will not admit that. Okay? If the BIR found out that you did not declare 1 million peso sale, that is treated as taxable income. So if you are a corporation, you will be subjected to 30% tax of that 1 million, which is equal to 300,000. Is that correct? Again, what is the tax deficiency? 300,000 pesos. Now, aside from that, there's what we call as a surcharge. How much is the surcharge? Well, if you went to the BIR, okay, and it is a simple neglect of not reporting 1 million, and then later on you are voluntarily reporting that 1 million, it will be subjected to 25% surcharge. However, if you were subjected to audit, okay, and they found out that you underdeclared 1 million sales, then the surcharge will be 50%. Okay? So if you're caught, surcharge 50%. If it's voluntary surcharge, it's 25%. So going back to our example, how much is the tax deficiency? 300,000. Is that correct? Now, the surcharge would be 50%. That would be 150,000. Is that correct? Okay. Now, what if the tax due or tax deficiency is for the year 2018. And then you have to compute interest for 2 years. So 300,000 times 12% times 2 years. So that would be the interest. Now, for each document that you did not file, maybe you did not file in the quarterly return, you did not file some other returns, it would be 1,000 per document. So you see, aside from the tax deficiency, they will add up items like surcharge, interest, and compromise penalty. And then they will give you the total amount, and then you have to pay. Okay? Sige. So those are the items. Okay. Now let's go to the assessment procedure. Now, they determined that here's a taxpayer subject to audit. They conducted the audit. Okay. And then they will issue you PAN. Okay. Or pre-assessment notice. Now, the pre-assessment notice is issued by the Regional Assessment Division informing the taxpayer of its tax deficiency. Now, if the taxpayer receives PAN, it has 15 days to reply or to comply. Okay? So, if you don't agree for your tax, for example, it was determined that you need to pay 400,000. So, you will reply within 15 days. What happens if you did not reply within 15 days? Then you receive another letter which is called the final assessment letter or FAN. Okay, so first it's PAN. You don't reply within 15 days. Later on, you receive another one. It's FAN, meaning it's final. Because with pre-assessment notice or PAN, you still have the chance to uh, protest the amount. Okay, so it will be subject for reduction of taxes. Okay, now even if you replied your protest or justification, but your reply is not meritorious, meaning they did not buy your alibi. Okay, then still they will issue FAN or FLD, formal letter of demand. Okay, all right. Now, again, if you would contest the FAN or FLD, okay, and then your protest is not granted, okay, then they will issue FDDA, final decision on disputed assessment. Okay, so this is what happens, no? So for example, you submitted your protest, and then it was found out that the taxpayer is correct, and so it is resolved in favor of the taxpayer, then the assessment is cancelled. Okay, but if it is resolved with the reduction of liability, they found out that okay, you are correct, but still you have to pay some tax deficiency, so they will revise the assessment. But if the protest is not granted, then the resolution is sustained, and so they will enforce the current assessment. Okay? Now, what if you do not agree to the assessment? Okay, then you may appeal to the CTA or Court of Tax Appeals. Okay, take note, the lower courts do not have any authority for tax cases or tax disputes. It's only the BIR and the CTA or Court of Tax Appeals. However, if you appealed or you applied a petition to the CTA or Court of Tax Appeals and you are not amenable to the decision, then this time you can go to the Supreme Court. Okay? So the Supreme Court would decide. For example, a few years back, San Miguel was assessed for hundreds of millions of pesos by the BIR. So they filed their protest, but they lost, okay, even to the CTA. But when it went to the Supreme Court, San Miguel won, and so the Supreme Court ordered the BIR to refund this tax collected to the taxpayer. All right? Okay, so now, after the assessment, okay, so first they chose which taxpayer will be assessed, and then they conducted the audit, and then they gave the PAN, and then later on the FAN, and then later on the FDDA, okay, here, then it's time for the government to collect. Okay? Of course, the taxpayer has to pay. And the collection is enforced by the government if you fail to respond to the PAN and you fail to protest the FLD or FAN. Okay, that's not a question mark. Okay. And then letter B, denial of taxpayers protest by the CIR or his authorized representative. And it was upheld by the court. Take note, again, the non-injunction of tax collection applies to the lower courts. So if you are being investigated for tax deficiency, you cannot go to the courts and apply for TRO or temporary restraining order. As I mentioned, lower courts have no authority over tax disputes except for the Supreme Court. But you have to pass through Court of Tax Appeals first. Okay? Sige, hang on. Can you give me a minute? Yan. Jingle break lang, no? By the way, do you have any questions so far? No? Maybe we could take some questions. Maybe we mentioned something that is not clear, or you have question in mind, so maybe you could chat your question or raise your hand. Come on.
When they said like from what do you mean by from the following month? Does that mean before or after?
Oh, it's after.
Oh, all right.
Okay. So for example, my income for this month of June, okay, will be subject to withholding tax. Okay. Now, um, UC will deduct tax from my salary, and they should remit it on July 10th or on or before July 10th. Okay. So June is the month of my salary, and they will withhold or deduct income tax from my salary, and UC, my employer, should remit that on or before the 10th of the following month, which is July.
Mm.
Was I able to answer your question?
So basically, from the following month is after the said month, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. But please note that, we have a lot of tax compliances, no? So we have a lot of due dates too. Are there any more questions? Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So will you please give me a few seconds, no? Fluids. Unless there are questions, okay? So primarily, um, the taxpayer should pay in the form of cash, okay? However, what if the taxpayer did not pay. Now, here are the government remedies to enforce collection. So, first, they will impose tax lien. Okay, what does that mean? Like they will garnish your property. For example, I have a land. If the BIR found out that I have land, they will go to the registry of deeds and they will garnish or put a lien to my title so that I cannot sell my property. In fact, that is the first step before they go to number two, that's seizure of the taxpayer's property. Okay? So, the government has the power to take properties in settlement of your tax deficiency and other charges. Okay? So, that's called seizure. No? That's not tabing dagat, no? Okay? That's not the beach. It's, the taking of property. Okay? Sige. That's how corny to you, no? Yeah. All right. Number three, they would auction the sale of the property. So if they take property in favor of the government for your taxes, then they will sell that to satisfy your tax deficiency. Also, they have the power to file civil or criminal action. When we say criminal action, you will go you will be sent to prison. Okay. For civil, then you will be charged with damages, additional charges, for the lawyer and for any other cost in filing charges against you. Also, there's imposition of administrative penalties and fines like the surcharges and interest that we have mentioned, aside from the initial computation. Now, in number six, they can suspend business operation. There was a time when the BIR conducted Operation Lockdown. So they go around, if they find out that your business is not registered with the BIR, they will shut down your business, okay? Or they would lock down your business because they have the power to do so. Or number seven, this is entering into a tax compromise with the taxpayer. I mentioned Mighty Corporation, no? So that's a manufacturer of cigarettes. So, for example, the government wants 2 billion pesos for their tax deficiency. But, the taxpayer would say, can it be 1 million? And then maybe they would meet at 1.5 billion. So that would be a compromise. So it's like a win-win situation. And then that would be the way to collect taxes. Okay, so sometimes the government can lower the taxes and enter into a compromise. Okay, so these are the stages of collection. So first, there's what we call as the preliminary collection letter. Okay, sige. Um, and then like PAN and FAN, there's also like preliminary collection letter. And then later on, okay, whose signature is that? There's the final notice before seizure. And then number three, there's warrant of distraint, levy, or garnishment. No. So in number four, you would notice, okay, that the BIR can also research taxpayer property. So they may go to the Land Transportation Office, LTO, and find out the cars that you own. So they can take that. Or they would go to RD, Registry of Deeds, and they would research on all the properties that you own, and then they will take that. Okay? And then they will issue a notice of tax lien or notice of tax levy. And then they take your property, sell it, and then they may file civil or administrative action. Okay, here's the period of prescriptive period of collection. Okay, so with prior assessment is 5 years. Without prior assessment, it's 10 years. Okay, never mind that. No, that's not correct. Okay, all right. So that's how the government collects taxes. So first, they will assess, and in assessment, they will choose which or select taxpayer subject to audit. Okay, they will conduct the audit, and they will give the assessment. And then after assessment, they will collect. Of course, the taxpayer has to pay in cash. But if that does not happen, then the government has the power to take your property, okay, and then sell it, and then they may file also some criminal or civil action against the taxpayer. Now, let's go to the tax remedies of the taxpayer. By the way, do you have any questions so far?
Yes, sir. About criminal and civil action. So in criminal, you just go
Yeah.
to prison, and civil you just pay damage. Only that, the difference.
Oh, of course. Okay. Primarily, you have to pay. But if you don't pay, you go to prison.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
But sometimes it depends on the ruling. Sometimes you have to pay and then go to prison. Both. Okay. But most of the time, you will just have to be asked to pay. But the severity of the ruling depends on the taxpayer. So if you are not cooperative, like you are not showing up in court, we call that contempt of court. And then later on, the judge may require you to be in prison.
so, and how about the amount? It's based on the action.
The amount, well, it adds up. Like, for example, the tax deficiency is 1 million, right? You did not pay, and then the court filed a case against you. I mean, the BIR filed a case against you, and then you lost in the Court of Tax Appeals or even in the Supreme Court. And then that tax deficiency will add up, and then they will add, cost of the lawyer, interest, etc. So it becomes higher.
Yes.
Yeah. But, there's a saying that if somebody sued you and you are on your way to the court, while on your way to the court, you settle with the person that is trying to sue you so that you would reach agreement before you reach the court. Okay? Now, in that same principle, no? If a revenue officer found out about your tax violation, you try to settle it immediately so you have lesser amount to pay. Okay? And sometimes, these revenue officers are humans too. So, they are compassionate and understanding too. Okay? So sometimes when you plead with them or you reason out with them, they would just say, okay, I will forgive you this time, but you comply with these taxes, and then you will avoid these problems. Something like that. Okay. Yeah, any other? You have any other questions, issues? All right. So now let's go to the tax remedies available to the taxpayer. This is very brief, okay? So maybe we'll just take this for like 5 minutes or less. Okay, so again, let's go back. If we receive PAN or preliminary assessment notice, we have 15 days to reply. Okay? All right? If you did not reply, then they will issue you FAN. Now, if you receive FAN, you have 30 days to protest. Okay? Again, with PAN, you reply. Then you give your justifications. With FAN, you protest. Okay? Sige. So, these are the types of protest, no? Either you request for reconsideration, okay? No new issues, or reinvestigation if you have evidence. All right? Anyway, the BIR has 180 days to issue, to settle reinvestigation or reconsideration. Okay? So that's the case. What if you already paid and then later on you found some evidence or you found out that you have paid excessively? Then you go to number 2, recovery of erroneously paid taxes. All right? So here are the uh, rights granted to the taxpayer. So you may file a claim for refund or credit within 2 years from the date of payment of taxes, or file a petition for reconsideration within 30 days from the receipt of denial. Okay, for number 1. All right. For number 3, file a petition to the CTA within 30 days from the receipt of final decision. Number 4, if they did not act on your claim for refund or credit, okay, you may file for review before the CTA. But if the CTA has an adverse ruling, okay, you can appeal that again within 15 days. But again, if CTA denied your petition, that's the time that you can go to the Supreme Court. Take note, you already have paid the taxes. Okay, even if you did, you may file for a refund. Okay, for the amount that you have paid, or maybe it becomes a tax credit. No? A tax credit is something that can be deducted for your future taxes. All right, so those are the remedies available to the shareholder. I mean, the taxpayer. Sorry. Okay, so that's it. So, do you have any questions? Because if you don't, we'll be having our first quiz next meeting. No, I thought I was able to give you the true or false questions the previous meeting when we had our training. Have any questions? Because if you don't, then we will have to end our meeting. Okay? Questions? Well, yeah. By the way, I think I sent you the PDF, the scanned copy of chapter 19 of the textbook. You could read the other materials, other discussions, no, found therein. So I just lifted the important aspects, no, of the tax remedies of the government and the taxpayer. You will find there some charts, no, some detailed discussions. You can do that. Questions? Questions,
Sir,
class? Yes.
sir, paano po yung quiz?
Paano yung quiz? We do it through the Google Classroom the last time, no? But I had problems with the other sections because when I received the responses in the Google Classroom, I was not able to get their scores. But in fact, the students, upon submission, get their own scores. The reason why Google Classroom removed that feature is that my Google Class should be linked to the Google Class of UC. So in short, we cannot use Google Classroom anymore. Now, UC subscribe to Canvas, right? So Canvas is now available to us, and I will let you know if we will use Canvas, okay? Because as per UC, we should be using that by Wednesday next week, July 1. But we will meet on June 30, right? Okay.
Sir, within 2 hours, 30 minutes ba din ba yun? Or
Lesser, syempre, lesser. So I would notify you ahead of time that, you know what, we will be having an activity on this time, and it would be only up to this time. You know? So may time limit siya. Okay, although that's longer, no? Like in a classroom, if we can do that for 30 minutes, maybe we can do it for 1 hour, 30 minutes, no? So there's more window time in consideration for those who do not have reliable internet. But I will let you know ahead. Okay? Are there any other questions?
Sir, anong type po nung quiz?
Oh, anong type ng quiz? Normally, it's either multiple choice or true or false. Meron pa? Questions?
Sir, yung notes po ba na ngayon, sir, i-send nyo po?
Na-send na
Ay,
sa ating
na-send na.
Facebook group. Yes, yes.
Thank you, sir.
Okay lang. Wala na?
Sir, ilang items?
Ilang items? Okay. Okay? So, mga 20 siguro. Oo. Whoop.
So, didn't any computation?
Yes, Manuel, of course, there's no computation yet. Yeah.
Okay.
No, none yet. Like the 25%, 50%, and interest? No, not yet. Okay. Any other? All right. If you have no more other concerns, oh, by the way, there are some chats here. No, I just check on our chat. Okay. Paano if employed individual o taxpayer? Paano yung process na? Oh, by the way, no, employed individuals are not assessed most of the time because should there be any assessment, it's the employer that will be assessed because the employers are required to deduct taxes from the salaries of the employees. In fact, the employees no longer need to file income tax returns. We call this a substituted return because the employers are filing their tax return in their behalf. So, the employers are obliged to deduct the taxes from the salaries and then they will remit it to the government. So there is no legal liability to the employee. Okay. But if the employer did not deduct the tax and did not remit, it's okay. The employee is not subject to assessment. It would be the employer. And then the employer will have to pay the necessary taxes. And they no longer need to collect that from the employee. Okay? The question of Giselle, okay na, no? All right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Sige. Are there any other questions? Sige. If you have no more questions, then sa lahat ng business, required to pay yung 500 na registration? Yes. In fact, it's called annual registration fee. The 500 is required to all, even for organizations not doing business. For example, religious associations or organizations are required to, when they are required to file with the SEC, they are required to have ITR. So, if, for example, we have a religious association or organization registered with the BIR, they need to pay 500 every year. So they will fill up BIR form 0605 and pay that to the bank every January of the year. What if they would say, oh, sorry, we don't have any money or collections? They have to, okay, because it's a requirement. Okay? So that's the question of Rema. Any other?
So regarding the letter of authority,
Yes.
as mentioned a while ago, ang sabi niyo po kapag yung tataguan niya, then
Yes.
once it expires, the BIR will generate another
Yes.
LA. Just like that, sir, wala pong charges.
None. Because that is only the start, right? There's no assessment yet. Ayan. Okay? So, if you keep on running away and they were not able to serve, because they will lose the case technically, because the law requires them that the LA must be received by the taxpayer, right? So, if the taxpayer keeps on running away, okay, and then they will generate that again, then they keep on running away or maybe move to another location. The revenue officer has other more important things to do. So normally they will give up on you. Yeah, okay. But of course, I know that if you are the taxpayer, you will comply. But you know what? Yun ang ginagawa ng ibang taxpayer, ano? Especially if they know the technicality, or maybe if they were advised by a lawyer. Because from the start, if you avoided the LA, there will be no assessment, and therefore you have no liability to pay tax dues. Yeah. Unless they know where your business area is, and then they will shut down your business. But some, if they have very high tax liability for that business, they will shut down the business as far as their BIR registration is concerned, and then they'll open up with another one with another taxpayer's name. Yeah. Maybe they come up with a corporation or maybe partnership, or they will name it after their son, their wife, katulong, yeah, okay, and have a fresh start, something like that. But of course, the proper way to do is to pay the taxes. Any other question? Okay, so why is it that the CTA has a different decision with the Supreme Court? You know, this is a legal thing. From the point of view of the BIR, which is like the lower court, and then later on the CTA, they would like to collect taxes. Okay? And take note that this is a judicial system, that the Supreme Court has the ultimate authority to settle cases. And that's normal, no? That's normal. That the Supreme Court, okay, through their wisdom, would determine all the facts and the legalities, and they will find out that some may be, because there are some gray areas, take note, no? In the in our tax law. And the entity that has the final authority to give legal opinion about it is the Supreme Court. So under in the CTA, okay, they applied this tax provision in favor to the government, but later on, the judges of the Supreme Court or justices of the Supreme Court would interpret it otherwise, and so they will give a ruling in favor of the taxpayer. That's a normal judicial procedure. Parang ganito, ano? So, you are convicted as a criminal, okay? And then you appeal to the Court of Appeals. Still, you are convicted. And then later on in the Supreme Court, they will reverse the decision because they have different appreciation, okay, of the legal evidence. And they cannot dispute that. That's okay. Okay, you are asking about Mr. Aquino, no? Yeah. He resigned. Mr. Aquino resigned because after getting married, um, he does not need money anymore. I'm just kidding, no? So Mr. Aquino married his wife, who is working in Italy. So he resigned because I think he will follow his wife to Italy. Okay? So you miss him?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. I will let him know that you miss him so much. Okay? Any other question? All right. If you have no more questions, then you are allowed to leave our meeting. You have a nice day ahead.
Bye, sir.
Goodbye.
Bye, sir.
See you
Bye,
again.
sir.
Bye,
Bye,
sir.
sir.
Thank you.
Bye, sir. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, sir.